Thanks very much for that introduction. Hi, my name's Jojo. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Electron, and we develop local energy marketplaces where we basically connect renewable generators to electric cars and electric heaters and kind of cool consumer things like that. So if you want to hear about Electron, we're going to be speaking on the lab's live stage, one of my colleagues at 5 p.m. But today I have the huge pleasure of being on the other side of the curtain and being able to be the one to ask questions. So this session is going to be in the form of a kind of rapid fire, three amazing energy experts answering 5 questions in 5 minutes each, and then we'll have a discussion about some of those questions. They are all leading voices on energy technology. As a coincidence, they're all women, and by no coincidence at all, they're all great friends of mine. So I am thrilled to introduce you to them just now. So the first is Claire. If we can bring Claire online. Voila. So Claire leads UK strategy at National Grid. It's been Claire's job for many years to keep the lights on. And Claire's got a pretty kind of unparalleled top-down view of some of the kind of biggest tech trends that are driving towards net zero. And for those of you who don't know, who think net zero is a 2050 thing, National Grid's trying to operate a zero carbon grid by 2025. So it's pretty quick. Next, we're going to bring online Emma. We can do this. Perfect. Emma is all over all of this. I mean, she's the outgoing Deputy CEO of Renewables UK and an incoming CEO of Energy UK. Emma's kind of covering all of it, but is going to take a particular kind of view here on the consumer perspective on this and the kind of tech kind of human coupling. And last but by no means least, we've got Maria coming on, who's the CEO of award-winning energy tech company Verv, and she's going to be taking the lens of actually like tech implementation and what you can actually do and what Verv's technology actually enables consumers to do. So I'm going to hand over in 1 second, just quickly. The first 5 questions are going to be: 1, what power do consumers have in driving net zero? 2, what role can tech play and where's it going to have the greatest impact? 3, what else, in terms of kind of policy or behavioral change is needed to support this? 4, what one area still needs the most innovation funding? And 5, are we thinking radically enough about the future of energy? So over to you, Claire, first.
Thanks, JJ. I am going to attempt to answer those 5 questions. I'm sure I will forget at least one. So, as you said in your intro, National Grid has the privilege of leading and facilitating the route to net zero across all energy sectors within the UK and the US. I'm going to concentrate on the UK. But what we've seen over the last 5 years in particular are huge tech changes going from top down that have really started and escalated the journey to decarbonising energy. So when I talk about energy vectors, I'm thinking power, heat and transport. For power, we've seen very rapid development of tech in terms of not just different types of generation, so solar panels, wind generation, but also technologies that go alongside them that are absolutely vital to ensure that at National Grid we're able to operate the system. So I'm thinking specifically batteries and other assets that you need on the electricity system to enable the new types of renewable generation to operate. For transport, we've really seen huge amounts of innovation in the space, both in terms of tackling things like range anxiety for EVs, so a really rapid expansion in the ability of batteries to have a much bigger capacity, but without massively increasing the size of the unit, but also actually integrating tech into the cars. So if you think back, the first very early models of EVs looked really space age. You had to really want an EV to go out and buy one. Now they've entered much more into the luxury desirable products, so they're much more in the space that tech firms like Apple operate in. So people want one, and that is largely because of the tech and the design that's gone into them. And then for heat, probably not a topic that so many people are really familiar with, but there's huge debates going on within the industry at the minute, and within kind of linked tech industries, about how we start to shift away from our reliance on hydrocarbons and basically replace the way that we provide heat, both for domestic heating and industrial processes, and use a completely different energy source. So lots of conversations at the minute about hydrogen, how you produce it, how you transport it. And, you know, if you thought back probably only 5 years, that conversation wasn't happening. And to a lot of people then would have felt quite space age. You know, it's kind of something that you'd see on a sci-fi movie or something, like this world isn't powered by natural gas, it's powered by hydrogen. So really exciting tech developments, and I've had the privilege to be involved in the journey with a lot of those. But I do believe very strongly that that isn't the whole answer to achieving net zero. I really think that the power to make that journey a real success lies with the consumer. So going with a top-down tech approach can only get you so far. It's done amazing things. We have just yesterday, I think, celebrated 2 months without any coal generation being used in the UK. That is a direct result of the developments that we've seen in technology. But we won't get to a net zero world without a bottom-up approach that's really driven by the consumer. So that's why I'm so excited to be on this panel. You know, Emma and Maria and JJ, yourself, you're at the centre of some of those developments and conversations. I would probably leave my introduction with the answering your final question: are we being radical enough with how we're thinking about the change? For sure not. Yeah, I work at a international FTSE 25 corporate. We have changed significantly how we think about things, how we operate. The only thing I am certain of going forward is that there will be all sorts of developments that we will see over the next 2, 5, 10, 20 years that we're not even considering right now. And that's why it's such an exciting space to be in.
Brilliant, Claire. Thanks so much for that kind of top-down introduction. I mean, the kind of big hitters, right, of transport, heat, and hydrogen. One of the, just pick up that one of the interesting things about the kind of transport and heat is, like, everyone knows transport's part of it. There was a poll of what caused kind of emissions, and 77% of people thought that it was cars, and cars are responsible for about 27% of emissions. But about 5% of people thought that it was central heating, which is responsible for 30% of emissions. So I think a lot of that's unseen. Brilliant. Over to you, Emma. Same 5.
Okay, it is almost like we coordinated this, and I know we didn't because this is my envelope that I've written my things on. But the first 2 things I was going to say is, firstly, technology is amazing. The top-down application of technology is where, certainly in the UK, we've achieved most of our decarbonisation to date, because, as Claire said, we've managed to switch off our coal-fired power stations and move over to large-scale renewables. And that's happened largely because of the technology change that we've seen over the last decade. So in most parts of the world now, wind and solar, depending on whether you've got high wind or high solar yield in your country, will be cheaper than most fossil fuel technologies. And that change has been driven by technology improvement, has reduced the prices has changed the energy market and means that those technologies are now preferred. I actually worked on the coal phase out when I was at WWF, and at the time it was seen as something that policy would have to really drive. And in the event, all we needed was a kind of statement from the Secretary of State and a clear market signal, and the market and technology has done the rest. So I really do buy into the idea that technology has some of the answers to the big questions on decarbonisation. However, I spent the first part of my career trying to make loft insulation sexy because, as Jojo says, the biggest challenge for decarbonisation in the UK and in many other Northern Hemisphere countries is heat, and twofold. One, the technology we use to generate heat is fossil fuel powered, and two, particularly in countries with old building stock like the UK, our buildings and houses are terribly inefficient. And loft insulation is actually a very interesting technology, let me tell you. It is. I spent a lot of time about this. It is very, very cheap. As soon as you put it into your house, it's net resource negative. It saves you so much money that the costs of doing it up front almost immediately pay back on your energy bills. It's simple, everyone understands it, it's been going for decades. It should be, by all measures of successful technology, really easy to get consumers to do it, and they just don't. And the government tried to incentivise consumers to put loft insulation in their houses. And the reason I'm telling you this is eventually, after discovering they literally could not give it away, they gave the problem of loft insulation to the behavioural economists in the government, who went away and looked at it, did some focus grouping with people, and came back and said, we don't think you need to give the insulation away. We think people will be happy to pay for it. What's stopping them is that their lofts are a mess, and they can't be bothered to unpack their lofts to have the insulation put in. So charge them a bit for the insulation and offer loft clearance, and that's your solution. And that is exactly what they did.
Brilliant.
I think that is a really fascinating example of where government policy, technology, and people collide, and not thinking about the people bit first can be your complete undoing. It's not just lofts that applies to. We've seen recent examples in energy policy where there's been market failure or technology failure because of people. We had an onshore wind ban in the UK effectively for the last 5 years, basically because a small group of largely Conservative MPs opposed the technology, and there was a fragile hung parliament. And that has now been overturned because of a lot of work done to understand the politics and the feelings that Conservatives have around wind. This is when onshore wind was so cheap that it was basically subsidy free. So from an energy policy point of view and from a market point of view, it made complete sense to have it in the conversation. Secondly, thinking about the coal phase out, one of the reasons it took so long before the market was ready was that MPs were very, very worried about coal workers and parts of the UK which have relied on coal for jobs and kind of local investment and the communities there. And there's been a lot of work done in the process of looking at coal phase out of the globe and trying to make sure that that is a just transition, and that investment in skills and retraining in people is as important to getting coal phased out as the economics of coal itself, and the fact that we now have alternative technologies ready. Now, all of that, those kinds of phenomena with people hitting policy and technology are about to get worse in decarbonisation, because for the next decades, the areas that we need to decarbonise are much more personal. They are, as Claire and Jo has said, about heat. They're about going into people's homes and changing boilers. They're about the cars that we drive. And since the latest international climate change report, it's also about how we consume things. So, our diet, how we travel internationally or not, everything is about to get much more personal. And then in the energy transition itself, all of the technology development is pushing us towards a world where we'll have many more market participants, much more flexibility, and potentially even more opportunities for chaos. So here's my radical idea. We need to put people first when we're thinking about market design, and rather than worrying about kind of big technology and decarbonisation policy, what I really want to see is more investment in things like how we change, behaviour change, who pays, and who owns the things that are valuable in the energy system, like data, going forward.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Emma. Like, I think that was an amazing kind of opening up of the fact that this kind of energy tech story isn't just a hardware story anymore. There's this kind of cross section of data, behavioral analysis, analytics, and one like big buzzword in the energy sector is now X as a service. So like heat as a service instead of buying power. And I absolutely love Emma's spin on it, which I've never heard before, which is like loft clearing as a service, which is just genius. Great. And over to Maria. Same 5 questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great segue into talking about data as well. I thought you were going to tee me up better there, Jojo. We ended up on loft. So yeah, around the power of consumers and driving net zero, I would say that for excuse me, sorry, I'm in the very late stages of pregnancy and I'm really, really suffering with heartburn. Can I just put up my water 1 second?
Okay, so while Maria does that,
sorry.
Power. I just want to remind everyone that Slido's running for this. So if anyone has any questions that they want to ask explicitly to these experts, please send them through Slido. And otherwise, I'll make up my own, which will be much, much harsher.
Yes, Maria, back to you. Silent for too long. So yes, when it comes to consumers, I would like to focus on not only the consumer themselves, but it's more about the products in their home. So although behavioral change is so important, and the work that Emma talked about in terms of you need behavioralists to help you understand how customers do respond. With things like smart meters, we saw people realize that their electricity was costing them the same as a cup of coffee, so it didn't actually drive behavioral change. And this is a lot of the background of the work that I did previously on trying to expose people, this is how much your washing machine's costing to run. This is how much your dishwasher's costing to run. But until we bring automation into it, I actually don't think the consumers in all cases will change. So around big things like the loft example is perfect. There's an immediate payback there. And you have more chance than against the smaller things, like all those little incremental changes that could be made. And an example I always like to give is there's a brilliant film called Any Given Sunday. It's got Al Pacino, and he does this speech called the inches speech, and he talks about grinding with your fingernails to get that inch, and they ultimately win the game. And I really feel that for consumers, we need them to take their own inches, but I think a lot of that will be through automation. So I'll focus obviously on technology, given that that's what we do. So at Verv, we provide predictive maintenance technology for white goods. So we can see in the utmost detail what's going on in appliances in homes and hopefully predict faults in them before they occur, which reduces waste of appliances. And that is only made possible by the trend that many more appliances in homes and businesses are becoming smarter and more connected. So there's a huge number of possibilities for how we can actually enhance the efficiency of those appliances and the home by using the data that they generate to learn more about them and then making automated decisions. So where I can see this ending up in the future is around things like demand side response. So for example, we could only allow appliances such as like non-critical appliances like washing machines to be turned a certain time of day, for example, in the middle of the day where we've got lots of energy provided by solar. With fridges, we could turn them off for extended periods of time, and they're so well insulated that it wouldn't make any difference to the temperature of the food inside. However, for the electricity consumption of a given area, it could be really important. So I think that technology, obviously, given my background, I would say technology is going to have a massive impact, and it isn't just, demand side response. It's obviously about being able to repair and reduce waste of appliances. So at the minute, for example, there's 1 million electrical items currently being sent to landfill each week. With these appliances, that are really short-lived, and they generate 1.1 tons more CO2 than better designed, more efficient appliances. So it's really important that we use that technology to our advantage and ensure that while they enhance the customer experience, they also save energy at the same time. So that's kind of my deep dive into white goods in houses. And yeah, in terms of the area that needs like innovation and funding and thinking radically, I don't think we are thinking radically enough. Startups like ours are trying our best, but there are challenges in terms of policy and the slowness of the incumbent energy companies that are a challenge to us right now.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Okay, so I still don't have any questions on Slido, and that was amazing, all three of you, which we knew it would be. I want to pick up on one of the kind of maybe inherent conflicts that listeners might have thought from some of those answers about what it's gonna take, that I don't think is actually a conflict, but I think we need to kind of bring this out. Okay, so I think we had two big answers on what it's gonna take. One was incentives, which feels very human, right? And the other was like automation, which is like very inhuman. Like, I know, like, we all know that we need this kind of top down, bottom up, but actually like what does it take for one to kind of move to the other, and what's the tipping point, and why aren't those two kind of actually on opposite sides?
Oh man.
Like, it's interesting because I think we've all picked up different elements of that when we've answered. But Maria bringing up the smart metering is in the UK is a great example of actually it wasn't incentives that were used, it was mandated that everyone should have a smart meter in your home. But whilst there has been an education program about why you should have that meter in your home, it just hasn't appealed to people, and the implementation of that technology in people's home, which can save you money, hasn't been that successful. So I do think there's a combination of, well, I was going to say either incentives or mandation. It's probably realistically a combination of the two. With automation, but I think what is really important is that you put the user at the center of that. So the customer, say like me and you in our house, you have to, there's been a big take up of electric cars, of smart heating thermostats, smart lighting. Like, I've got all of those because I'm an energy geek and I like that kind of stuff. I can't program any of it to work together. I have to do it manually. That's beyond my capability. But I've got 5 different hubs plugged into my broadband router, which drive me mad. Yeah. Who in their right mind, who is not an energy geek, is going to say, yes, please come and plug a separate hub for each of these into my broadband router? And, oh, by the way, none of them work together. So you're going to have to either work out how to code something yourself to do it, or program them all manually. And I think we've got to put the person in their home that's going to be using this stuff at the center. And I tweeted the other week, I really think one of the underrated skills in the energy industry is a user interface specialist. So you've got to make the stuff interesting. You've got to appeal to people's desire to want the latest technology or a really cool gadget or something, and you have to save money, and like all of those things have to happen together. So I haven't answered your question, Jojo. I've just asked it in a different way.
I mean, both though, right? Like, the problem with the question is that there isn't an answer. The only answer is both worlds have to be possible. And I've two I have more pet energy hates, but like leaving climate skepticism aside, that my two major pet energy hates are, one, I've been in so many rooms where people talk about the consumer as if there's one, and Claire is absolutely right that there's lots of different types of person and household that are going to be using this technology. and hardly any thinking into proper market segmentation. And what's really interesting about the energy transition is some of the new market entrants, some of the successful suppliers and disruptors are exactly successful because they are really capturing that value proposition well. They've done their market research. They're not lazy about working out who they're trying to sell to, and they're making it easy for all different kinds of consumers to get involved. So that's one. But there will be people who, if we're not careful, will get left behind. So I think, making sure we're thinking about all kinds of consumers and which ones we incentivize, which ones don't need incentivizing, just need the right frameworks and comms, and which ones need regulation is important. And my second pet hate is we talk about the future energy system as if it's either big centralized old-fashioned kit plugged onto the network that will need some kind of centralized system architecture to support it, or really flexible, everyone doing peer-to-peer, everyone with an EV. And in reality, it's both in most countries where there has been some kind of grid. And even then, if we're building new grids, because we need heavy industry on the system, you probably need a bit of big transmission connected generation. In the UK, we've got like 50 gigawatts of offshore wind going on the system, as well as all this stuff at the other end, like this. So it's both, not either, and that is the real challenge there. I think the little bit of the answer is some of the technology we've all described, and technology like what Electron has, Jojo, where the kind of the things that stitch those parts of the system together, who owns them, who operates them, who can access them, that's the key. And again, not enough thinking goes into that bit of the industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Maria, you've got to come in on this, because someone's got to say something about trust, right? Because trust is very human. You trust automation.
Yeah, the solution to a lot of these problems really is data. And as Emma and Claire have both said, no consumer is the same as another. And to get that really clear picture of how someone behaves and how someone acts, you need data on that. So the energy systems catapult, the heat systems part, did some really great work on how people use their central heating. And if you have like a Nest thermostat, even though that is supposed to drive energy efficiency, I had one, and my husband would come home and just turn it as far as he could turn it because he was freezing. I said, this doesn't make any sense. Turning it up to 30 degrees doesn't increase the rate at which the house gets to a warm temperature. And so consumer behavior is really interesting. And the more data we have on how consumers are using the electrical and obviously the gas energy in their home, the more we can innovate to drive efficiency. But that is personal information. I think that's what you're alluding to, Jojo, how people feel about data, or their data being used for those purposes. And we obviously had GDPR come in, and what else can be inferred gets people really nervous. So I can give an example when it comes to washing machines, since this is where I nerd out. There's a way of finding faults in washing machines that involves putting a microphone inside the washing machine. As the microphone listens to the vibrations of the motor, and so you can tell as that signal changes if it's about to break down. But obviously, from a consumer messaging perspective, a microphone inside someone's washing machine really freaks them out, because their washing machine's listening to their conversations the way the Amazon device does, that I'm not going to say the word of because it's going to start talking to me. So I personally really would love to be able to get data on everything going on in consumers' homes, because we could drive such a more efficient energy system and create amazing consumer products that would save them money. But the battle with that is against consumers' perception of that, ensuring that consumers are protected, and which inevitably involves some sort of legislation, which then just slows everything down. So again, I'm just giving problems and questions.
But also, this is my other bit, as I work in the market and I work for private companies, but I get to be the hippie in the room because I work for a big international NGO. And I would also say the thing with the data that I'm really aware of, and that we have seen through the kind of big technology changes, data is going to be really valuable in the future energy system. The ability to kind of track, understand electrons and sell personal data about how we use them is going to be valuable. And I think it's also important to make sure that if it turns out to be really valuable, that you own your own data in that way and can sell it, and that who benefits from that data is really key. Not just is it being safely managed and protected, but has a company come along and taken something valuable of yours that they're benefiting from, I think is a really important thing to bear in mind. And that's the role of the state, maybe, I would say. That's what their job is in this new world.
Yeah.
Interesting tech angle, sorry, Jojo, in the data space is an example of where this sector hasn't implemented tech that has existed for a long time because it hasn't needed to, and that's in handling big data or just like volumes of data. So you can go and talk to one of the old kind of incumbent players in the energy industry, and they'll tell you about the data that flows through the networks. Like, it is nothing, the data flows on the energy networks, compared to what happens in banking, even just credit card transactions. The amount of data that flows far dwarfs anything that happens in the energy industry, and we've just never had to deal with that much data, so nothing is set up to handle that much data. The tech is there to do that, but how you implement existing tech into an established system and hierarchy and network is a really interesting challenge as well.
Yeah, and that's a really, really important question. Can we flip that bottom up? Because we're kind of talking here about the role of the consumer, and the consumer at the moment is like sitting at the bottom, and they've got all this data, and they've like got all this stuff coming in the home, and we're getting tons of love on Slido about people who are developing their homes now, and like want to know, like, should they put in a heat pump? Shall they do this? Like, so let's answer, like, what can they install in their houses now? But also, like, what can they do about that whole kind of data problem? Is it something they can ask for to be there for them to spend? Is it like, how are consumers going to interact with their data, and what can they demand who?
Can I do the building fabric one, and then I think that Claire should talk about smart meters, or someone should talk about smart products. But you should insulate your house. Please insulate your house if you have money to do house renovations. Like,
can they insulate their house and get mechanical ventilation and heat recovery systems? Yes, like heating, like kind of energy efficiency and ventilation. Get that right. Get a building surveyor out to tell you what to do with your home. And if you're talking to us from anywhere where you've got an old house, the ventilation question is really important. And get someone specialist to help you. There are energy assessors. That's the first thing. Do that. Fabric first, and then secondly, your heat solution. I just did my house, and I am a climate activist that doesn't fly, and I put in a gas condensing boiler. And the reason is the twofold. The economics didn't stack up for the heat pump, and my local heat network, the kind of my district network, could not tolerate the connection. It just was like decades of paperwork to try and get it done, and we're not going to be in this house for a long time. And so I've created a problem for the next person, but my house is incredibly energy efficient. And I think by the time they regulate in for renewable heat as opposed to very efficient boilers, it will be the right time to replace the heating system that we've put in. So fabric first, as efficient a heating system as you can get, and look into a heat pump if you can. If you're in a well-insulated building, an electric heat pump will do for you, whatever the kind of building that you've got. If you're in a rural property, probably a ground source heat pump. If you're on the gas grid, the government is looking at hydrogen trials, and we may find that ends up being a kind of a greener gas mix. So my boiler, I'd have to change the boiler, but arguably on the gas network in London, in the long run in cities, we might find it's not heat pumps that are the answer anyway. Right, that's my... There's my gadgets. Smart meters and smart appliances.
Boilers. So you can get hydrogen ready boilers now as well. So there's, I think, like Emma hit the nail on the head with all the questions we're seeing on Slido. The answer to what you can do now depends on you your kind of financial situation and your house. There isn't one stock answer, which is everyone should look to install a heat pump or everyone should look to go with a hydrogen ready boiler. It will depend on circumstances, but if you are in the position where you personally can do it and there is a solution that works for your house, then do it. Because like the only thing that is certain is that the way that we currently heat our homes is not going to be viable long term. So if you are in the position to change it now, then change it. And there's so many incentives and things that you can take advantage of. There's mortgage companies now as well that are letting you add those types of things onto your mortgage.
Yeah, well, I was gonna, and I thought maybe we might have talked about solar panels, which the other ladies on this call know more about than me. But if it was me personally, I've moved recently, and it's kind of on my list of like solar panels I would love to put in, because they would generate more energy than I'd need, which is really cool. Again, as Emma said, you kind of have to work out the economics on it, but I love the idea of being self-sustaining. And I think like the amount of vegetable patches that sprung up during COVID-19 because everyone suddenly realized how reliant we are on supermarkets, and I kind of felt like that about energy for quite a long time. So I love the idea of trying to pull myself off grid, and it's not really off grid. So I would look at that. In terms of smart appliances, it's not really there yet in terms of the full home energy management system. However, those efficiency ratings, I don't think will be the way of the future, but do look into when you're buying a new appliance, the cost to run it, because that's not information that's very well presented to consumers right now. An example I love to give is about, so my parents have this extra fridge in the garage that we call the beer fridge, and it came from my great aunt's house. So she died in 2001 and she was 101, and
I'm laughing about the age of
I mean, she's 101. She got a great innings. So I don't know how long that fridge was in her house for, and now it's the beer fridge in our garage. And I'm like, how much is that thing cost to run, even for the few days a year that you put it on? Like, you could buy a new fridge, just buy a new fridge. And so I think a lot more transparency around that for consumers would be really useful going forward. But yeah, I'm a bit of a like tech nerd, so I would just always go for the like smartest, most connected appliance I could afford.
Brilliant. So we've got 7 minutes left on this session before we move into the separate Q&A session. We've got a couple of other questions coming in. I think that people want to go kind of deeper into the kind of people side of automation and trust, but maybe we've touched on that, so maybe we can do that in the next session. There's a question here saying a lot of consumer actions discussed here wouldn't be obvious to the average consumer, and there's always been a mass disagreement between panels on what we should even do on our kind of boilers. So the question is, how can we educate or encourage consumers to take action better? And actually, I'm going to add to that. And who should be doing that education? Like, where should it be coming from?
Yeah. I was gonna say something that we have kind of slipped into, is talking about. It's actually one of the original questions, right? Which is how far can this be a bottom-up kind of people-led change program for the planet, or how much of it is going to have to be done to us? My daughter is absolutely losing it. I'm going to have to feed her in a minute. We all want to talk about the interesting things. I mean, that's why I bang on about loft insulation and heat, and we all have said that. People don't want to talk about it. They don't realise it's important. They want to talk about EVs, which are exciting, or smart stuff, which is exciting. But the truth is, we're going to have to get people to do the boring, cheap stuff. And I suspect that the answer to that will be regulation for the people that can afford it. We're going to have to make people do some of this, because the science on climate change is scary, and we don't have the time to let people to like make their mind up to put in not a gas boiler in their loft. People like me should have been regulated into doing a heat pump if that's what we thought was the right, thing at the time. regulations around that change should have been simplified by the government or the regional authority for me to do that. So some of the boring, necessary stuff will have to be regulation. The rest of it is this thing about kind of really freeing up where the value in the data is, I think, the value in the market is, a lot of which is about data and data flows and understanding how people use things and then offering them the right propositions or incentives to change. So again, I think it's probably a both question, and we're going to have to wrap our heads around the idea that some of this stuff we're just going to have to be made to do, because the Arctic is currently 30 degrees in temperature, and the speed with which the climate is changing is really scary. And if we want to just have an economics-based conversation about that, you know, that we shouldn't, but the consequences of that in terms of you know, in the UK, flooding or extra heat waves or the stress on our infrastructure more than outweighs the cost of regulating some of this stuff into happening for people.
Yeah. I think we need to stop treating people like idiots. So Extinction Rebellion, whatever you think about how they're going about what they're saying, they've really got people to sit up and take notice of their message. And that's what we're going to need to do. We're just going to need to tie some components together to say, okay, so, you know, I hear most people now are aware of climate change and the impacts, but that is what leads to the flooding that we're seeing, the gorgeous weather that we've had in the UK, which followed a really kind of wet, cold period. You know, that is all being driven by something. And giving people the facts, say, you mentioned, Jojo, people are completely unaware of the contribution of their central heating system to climate change, or their lovely wood burner and what that's, and we need to stack those things up for people, so like show them what the problem is and then talk about the solutions. And I think Emma's right, you know, unfortunately we are going to be in a world where some of this stuff is going to have to be mandated, but that's no excuse for not treating people like adults and explaining the reason for that in the first place.
Yeah,
brilliant. Now I'm getting so many Slido questions now. I think we're going to have to take these across to the Q&A, so please join us there if you can. But I just want to give like a 30-second kind of closing statement on each of you, and like, what is the key thing that consumers themselves like what should people leave here and know is their kind of role or duty in driving net zero? Max 30 seconds each. Like, what's the one thing, if we're going to go here, we're going to do something tomorrow, are we going to install a smart meter, or are we going to start looking at our data, or are we going to start giving out our data? Like what's the kind of one thing that someone watching this can kind of go and do? And that's unfair because you've all said there's no one thing, but like if everyone did it, like what would the most meaningful thing be? Just top of head.
I was going to say, I'm going to totally steal Emma's thunder. So I'm going to say, first thing, insulate your house or where you live, if you have the ability to do it. Second thing is start looking into what you could do in the house to control the energy that you're using and have more control over it yourself. Control,
brilliant.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm jumping in on you. Yeah, I mean, smart meters are as much as they've got bad press. Yeah, looking at your meter, looking how much you're using. Some smart solutions, particularly smart heating.
Stand by, Emma. In 3 words. Back to Andy.
Okay, communicate with the people that have the power to help you, because this is system change, not just individual change. So tweet your energy supplier, look into them and their business and how they're helping you, and then also write to your MP or your local authority and tell them how much you want to do this stuff and what they can do to help you.
Love it, amazing. Back to Andrew. Thanks guys so much. That was an awesome help.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.